Thank you for joining this Water News podcast. I'm David Duncan, broadcasting on behalf of OOSKAnews, the world's leading provider of news related to global water challenges. You can find our water news at www.ooskanews.com. That's OOSKANEWS.com. The annual United Nations Climate Change Conference, or COP, they're known as COPs, convened in November this year in Marrakech, Morocco, and was attended by about 30,000 individuals from governments, the private sector, civil society and NGOs. Focal issues of this 22nd COP, or COP22 as it's known, included water scarcity, water cleanliness and water-related sustainability to an unprecedented and welcome degree. OOSKAnews attended and reported on the Marrakech conference. I had an opportunity to talk to a number of attendees and participants with particular water-related perspectives on climate change. John Matthews, please introduce yourself.
My name is John Matthews, and I'm the coordinator for a global organization called the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, AGWA, which is about 6 years old. We are co-chaired by the World Bank and by the Stockholm International Water Institute, SIWI, and we have roughly 1,000 members located all over the world that work on water and climate issues. About 90% of those folks tend to have a kind of strong technical background, and I'm a scientist myself, but there are many people in engineering, economics, finance, even areas like law and governance. And we also have about 10% or so that are really also focused on policy issues, about how to take technical insights that we have been developing and seen emerging over the past few years, about how to really mainstream new approaches to make resilient water management into a policy context, so that at a national and a global level that people are able to help create policy and finance vehicles that will support and enable the methodologies that we've been developing.
And AGWA was very instrumental in establishing the initiative #ClimateIsWater. Perhaps you could tell us about that movement.
Absolutely. Climate is Water is a very exciting group. It formed just a little bit over a year ago. It came together quite rapidly. There was a recognition both within AGWA and many of our external partners that the water community was speaking with too many voices and often discordant and non-complementary voices, and that we needed to think much more carefully and collectively about how to make sure that water had a seat at the climate policy table, that we came as a unified partner, that water needed to do its business, basically, to get our house in order to interact with the climate policymakers. And we quickly came up with the name as a colleague at SIWI who came up with the name, and we think that really tries to capture the basic idea that really one of our core arguments is the idea that that the UN Climate Convention, that, especially as represented by the Paris Agreement that came out last year, will not become effective, it will not endure unless we recognize it also as a global water agreement, both in our efforts to reduce greenhouse gases and control their emissions and sequestration, and also to cope with the impacts of climate change on humans, on our communities, economies, and our ecosystems.
And there have been a number of activities that Climate is Water has been engaged in between Paris a year ago and COP22 in Marrakech. There was an event in Rabat during the summer.
That's right. It's been actually quite a busy year, considering that Climate is Water as a network is only about a year old. We have a very frequent and regular meetings. I'm on the steering committee for Climate is Water, and a lot of our work in the first half of the year was trying to take the momentum that we came out of Paris with, the energy that we felt that was really picked up by the French government, the host of the last COP, and the Moroccan government, the host of this COP, and turned that into a very important meeting that occurred in Rabat, the capital of Morocco, last July. That was an event that had about 700 people who attended. It was a very global conference, and it was, in a sense, a kind of exploded version, a policy version of Climate is Water, hosted by Morocco, to try and represent a very diverse range of views across the water community, and then synthesize that into a specific set of asks and initiatives that we could present here at the COP.
And speaking of COP22, perhaps not directly related to water, but there is a sense of optimism in the climate communities coming out of the milestones that are being passed to bring implementation of the Paris Agreement on climate change, which came just a week before we all gathered here in Marrakech.
That's right. The phrase that you hear very much in the blue zone, the zone where all the negotiations are occurring, is that this is a COP of action. What that means is that in Paris, in 2015, that the outcome of the COP was just a short document. It's a 2 or 3 page document, the Paris Agreement, and it's a framework. It talks about aspirations, it talks about high-level goals. What the COP22, the Marrakech COP, is about is dropping down to the level of countries. Each country that has ratified the Paris Agreement has made a commitment to what they want to accomplish in terms of climate mitigation and climate adaptation, and where they also see gaps and opportunities that might be occurring that are around those commitments. So it's meant to be articulating these goals. These documents are very formal. They're called NDCs, nationally determined contributions, and they're formal statements about what each country hopes to accomplish. So our work really here is to, I think most of the people in COP are very practical people. We are natural implementers, and I think that's what also connects the Climate is Water network, that we want, in effect, to make sure that those NDCs are as good as they can be, that that we can help the governments see where water is inside of their NDC if they haven't recognized it already, and then make sure that they are making credible, efficient, and effective choices about how to implement those NDCs from a water perspective, so they come up with really long-term, sustainable, resilient, and hopefully even holistic solutions.
And returning to water specifically, yesterday was a big day for the water communities in the Marrakech COP context.
That's right. One of the formats of this COP is that individual days are selected as action days, so that there's an emphasis around communications. Yesterday was the Water Action Day, and it was there were 2 important formal events. One was an open door event in which you saw the heads of many organizations, public sector, private sector, international, NGO, that they were talking about their commitment, their sense of need, their sense of urgency, and that was an enormous event. It must have been well over 1,000 people who were in that room. Then following it was a closed-door session, and I would say that was a working session. I was very honored, along with Aziza Akmouche from the OECD, to be able to be asked by the Moroccan government to moderate this event. And here you saw what the Moroccan government was able to identify as the kind of key players in contributing to the negotiation in the water community to make useful, very tangible and direct suggestions about how we can improve the climate policy. So thinking about the UNFCCC, and also thinking about at the level of national governments and their climate policy, but also, I think very significantly, thinking about what the water community can do, that we can contribute to the climate community. We have a seat at the table. We are not the table, and we have to have high hopes and maybe modest aspirations.
A returning theme has been the description of water as, in the climate context, not something that should be treated as a sector, but more of a linkage.
That's exactly right. This idea that water is a connector, not a sector, actually is I would say, a direct response of the water community to the UNFCCC. The way that the UNFCCC, it's been around since about 1991, I believe. It was the original Rio conference that the UNFCCC was founded. And even at the beginning, water was defined as a sector. And what that means is that it remains in kind of a narrow box. And there was an early assumption in the UNFCCC that water, that all of the sectors actually, forests, health, agriculture, energy, that they would not be privileged. That was the language used in the UNFCCC. Well, there is a water sector that is made up of people who worry about pipes and turbines and that there's a water business, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about water as a cross-cutting resource. In that sense, I think we've made what seems to be an increasingly persuasive argument that has really seeped well into the UNFCCC, that water is this cross-cutting asset that actually you need it as an enabling element in order to reach many other goals, and those goals relate to many of the other sectors, so energy and agriculture and healthcare in cities and forests and so on.
And yesterday also saw the launch of a form of manifesto on the part of the government of Morocco and the water family, a blue book which came with 10 recommendations, and you were part of creating that document. OOSKAnews has reported on it.
I think that this represents a really significant advance. I think this work was really led by the Moroccan government and a few other organizations, and it represents a very impressive showing about how we need to think in very concrete terms about how the water community needs to become a partner with the climate community. I would go so far as to say that we need to have a confluence, and so in that sense, it's very impressive. This is much more exciting to me really than Paris, which I thought was pretty exciting. That the host country has taken the initiative to place water so high as a priority that they have placed their efforts behind the Blue Book.
And it was very well received yesterday. But the people that I talked to were more water people than climate people. Do you detect a positive reception from the usual suspects in the climate community who have not previously thought so profoundly about water?
There is definitely a change. It's a very palpable change. I started coming to these COPs about maybe 6 years ago, and I would say that it was a long, hard slog for a long time, and what we see now is that there is a much higher level of awareness, a realization, a crystallization of the significance of water as this enabling factor. It's strongest on the side of adaptation. You now see so-called climate people that they may be referencing gender, or they may be working on urban issues, or most interestingly, maybe on even ecosystems, ecosystem-based adaptation. That you see, actually, we need to have much stronger water language. But what's more recent, and I think I saw the early signs no earlier, not before maybe 18 months ago, is a transition on the climate mitigation side. And climate mitigation has really two goals. It's supposed to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we put into the atmosphere, and it's meant to sequester, to collect and essentially store for long periods of time carbon and other greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere, in soil or trees, or maybe through some type of technological service. And interestingly, most of those clean energy solutions or sequestration services they use water as an integral component. Think hydropower. Hydropower is really kind of essential to how we try to think about our long-term climate goals, but also think about biofuels. These are some of the most water-intensive ways that we know of to generate electricity. And even farther, nuclear power uses water intensively for the cooling process. Most forms of solar actually use water intensively for their cooling process. And if we think about the sequestration of carbon, how we try to contain it within forests and soil, then clearly water is the key that locks it in. And so if we're not thinking about sequestration processes that integrate a long-term vision of sustainable water management, then we're really missing something.
So there's been the roadmap over the last 18 months, and milestones have been COP21 in Paris, where the concluding papers from the COP process did not specifically mention water, but there's optimism this year in Marrakech that will change, and that well, talk us through the process. I believe that next week bits of the Blue Book get presented to a plenary session. What happens, and when will we know whether this has been a win for water?
That's right. Literally this afternoon, we'll be finishing our formal set of recommendations. That there's a water champion that will address the UNFCCC next week, and there'll be a formal background document that comes out of that process too. It'll be presented to the parties, to the UNFCCC Secretariat for consideration, and we have high hopes that this will be accepted. It looks at both what the climate community can do and the water community can do, and it looks for some short-term wins, and it looks for some long-term wins. I think the other really important thing that we need to hear next week is who is the next host. And the next host, we're hoping, is going to be another country that's willing to take the baton from Morocco and France, Peru, and carry things forward. So we're not sure who that's going to be. There's lots of rumors, but nothing confirmed.
But OOSKAnews will come back to you, John, for some comment when we do have news, and of your observations on the developments next week. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.